Thank you for tuning in to LOP Radio. This is Liberty. I appreciate it. Today we are going to do a roundtable discussion. I think we're going to broach the subject of Russia. Joining me is Scarlette and Tiny. We'll see if anybody else rolls in to fill out the panel a little bit. It is an interesting subject. There's been a few changes in the situation, but it seems to be pretty stable at this point. I guess I'll start off the proceedings with my take on it. And I started a thread about this on the forum, the lunaticoutpost.com. Outpost.com. There's a thread there. If you look up Liberty, you can go to my threads and find it there. It's called My Take on the Ukraine Situation. And it's kind of a difficult situation to wrap my head around because it seems like we're trying to kind of understand a book, but we're only getting about one page per chapter of information, and we've got to kind of divine, what the rest of the story entails. And so is the way of politics, and especially the way of foreign affairs and the wonderful musings of our mainstream media and actually, the lack thereof as far as information goes. So what I think about the Ukraine situation is this is kind of a standard operating procedure for big business, the government doing its thing with foreign affairs, which is, of course, completely against the intentions of the founding fathers. We were told not to go overseas looking for monsters because we'll get into entangled affiliations with different countries, which is exactly what's happening. I think what happened was the U.S., the European Union, maybe even Russia was in on this. They used the Svoboda to start the revolution. And the Svoboda, if you're not familiar with them, they're kind of a ultra right-wing. There's been some speculation that they aren't affiliated with what was originally the Nazi Party, the National Socialist movement in Germany back in World War II, and they've actually kind of reflected that with a socialist nationalism, I think has got something to do with their name. So I think in this particular instance, they are somewhat vulnerable due to their ideologies, and that it's whatever those may be, you can kind of get that kind of movement fired up by, preaching nationalism and doing various types of propaganda to get them fired up and motivated to take action, and especially given the type of background, they're inclined to violence. So I think that what happened was the powers that be in that situation used them to kind of spearhead the revolution because they were able to pull off the violence and get the actual, the sniper activities and the various forms of violence that were necessary to actually get the ball rolling in the streets, as it were. So I'll just call them the globalists in this situation. They were able to get the work done. They were able to get it handled without any type of international incident. And I think that after that was over, they wanted to take care of Svoboda and kind of take them out of the equation, and in doing so, they assassinated the leader of that movement. There's famous pictures floating around the internet of the leader showing up to a parliament meeting with an AK-47, kind of set the tone for what that group was about. So he was assassinated, and I think that was an attempt to kind of cut them off at the knees and prevent them from having any leadership to go any further. A recent story was that Svoboda was retaliating by standing in front of a government building in I think it was in Crimea, and demanding, parliament members step down and come out, and that pretty much ended without much of a whimper or a bang. It kind of just it fell off the news media, as far as I know. I haven't gone back and done much research on that since then, because I kind of knew where it was going. I'm sure that they were expecting this retaliation, that they knew it was coming, and they more than likely had a plan in the wings, ready to take care of it. Because that's really kind of the CIA move. You could see where that happened with Iran, and where they've actually admitted that they went in to deposed the leader that they had there, and then of course they installed the Shah of Iran, and the horrors and atrocities that accompanied that. That we probably need to apologize to them for, because it really set their country back 100 years. So at that point, you've got a lot of posturing, a lot of talk of war. They're taking the temperature of the different nations, seeing if they're willing to go to war. Of course, all political leaders want war because they're run by corporations, and most corporations have a hand in the military-industrial complex. And you can read any, war military history books, and the military campaigns always kick up the economy, because all of a sudden everybody's working, and there's lots of money being poured in, and lots of labor and stuff like that. Unfortunately, that's great for the economy and for the politicians and for the corporations. What's unfortunate is the loss of life, the PTSD, the various things that happen when you set person against person to kill each other. So I think that at that point, Russia and the European Union are going to split up the Ukraine. I think that basically what most of this revolves around is, I talked to a gentleman from the Ukraine. Basically, the gist of our conversation, I explained to him about America and how we had problems in the beginning with foreign interests like France and England and different people interfering and backing different factions to kind of throw a monkey wrench in the founding of this country. Fortunately, it seems like we were able to get past most of that. Now it seems like we're right back in that same trouble again. He said that his country had been around for 400 years, but they had not been able to have any stable form of government, unfortunately. I then talked to a person that was from Russia, and he explained to me that probably what was important in this equation was the gas lines, and that the instability of the Ukraine was causing a lot of concern over the parties interested in the natural gas that's in Russia, that's piped through the Ukraine to get to Europe, to complete that financial puzzle there. So they've got every reason in Russia, European Union, and by proxy America, for some reason, have every interest in the world to step in and take over their government, install their puppets, and run it just like business as usual. So I think that was the gist of it, that the main concern was the instability over the land that the gas supply lines were occupying. I think that the politicians probably talk about this all day and all night, that this is probably their number one concern, is how to spread their globalism to the different corners of the earth and reap the benefits, and whoever gets killed and whatever country gets set in ruins and whatever people are oppressed or crushed in the process is not their problem. They were born to lead, or whatever their fantasy world tells them. So I think that's it. I think that's probably the long and the short of it, is that it was all theater that was made up to take over that. I think probably I've got my suspicions about Obama and how seriously D.C. takes him. Of course, he's done some things that they're probably not happy about. He didn't go into Syria. He stressed that there would be no military intervention, and he's doing exactly what the American people want. Love him or hate him, he at least on those two issues seemed to know where his bread was buttered and seemed to go with that. There's some other things I'm not happy about, but that's for a different show. So what I'd like to do now is, depending on who'd like to go next, either Scarlette or Tiny, I'll go ahead and pass the mic to them and see what their take on this situation is.
Okay. I took it from the perspective of the Ukrainian, mainly because I have a very good friend who's Ukrainian, and I was able to talk to her a little bit about this too. And I kind of look at it in a different view. And for me to put this into perspective, I had to look into the plight of the Ukrainians the history of the Ukraine, and I think it has, obviously we all know it has a lot to do with the strategic placement of that land and water bridge and how important that is. And you have to realize that their position has caused so much Ukrainian suffering all through history, from way back, Napoleon, Ottoman, Hitler was in there. The Ukraine has never really had any freedom, so to speak. They've always been oppressed or suppressed at some point. And I really think that, especially when they tried to get into NATO, which if they had gotten into NATO, they would have a lot better chance right now. And I think we as a country should be doing more than we're doing to help the people of the Ukraine be a free country. And I have a lot more I could say, but I'm going to pass to Scarlette now.
I can understand your point, but it's one thing to make the Ukraine a free country, and it's another for them to be able to stand up on their feet. And the Russians are attacking their naval capacity right now. Then you have the problems. The Russians really are responsible for Chernobyl, which everyone's forgotten about, that they're in the middle of building a sarcophagus for it, but that core is still melting down, and it will still go on melting down. And I think that's too much of a burden to put on a free Ukraine when they didn't cause it in the first place. They paid a terrible price for it. Plus, you have a whole section of them up in the north that want to be Russian. And you have this core in the middle that want to be Ukrainian. And we're all tied by treaties. It'll be interesting to see how this works out. But I do see it highly as Russian aggression.
You're right, they did split. When I was looking, and I hadn't realized that there was a pro-Russian Eastern Ukraine and a pro-European Western Ukraine. So no matter, even if they do somehow get free and have the freedom that they want, they're still going to have, like you said, Chernobyl to deal with, which, I haven't forgotten personally, but maybe others have, and that's sad. And they're still going to have their economic situation, which isn't the greatest, too, so.
Yeah, and I've got to, just real quick, this isn't necessarily a popular position, but I do have to state that I personally don't think it's the position of America to step in and start dictating, what countries should do what. I think we've gotten in a lot of trouble for that. We've lost most, if not all, of our reputation, whatever it was before, to the various campaigns that we've been involved in around the world, and it certainly isn't going to help us if this backfires, and I really don't see how there's any way it can't backfire.
Well, here's a little background on it. What Stalin did was he decided to redistribute the population, and so he put Russians in all the satellite countries, and the Russians always ended up being more equal than the others, so to speak. And so he sowed the seeds of what's the problems now is after you've lived there a generation or two, you figure, yeah, it's my land, I live here, and you identify with where you live. And so here's all these Ukrainians that were settled there some time ago by Stalin who are Russian, and of course their sympathies are with Russia. This problem is going to spread throughout all the satellite countries. The breakaway Baltic republics, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. I'm Lithuanian, and fortunately, maybe 15% of the population was settled in Russia. But if you have someplace like Latvia, where it's almost 65% Russian, now if they start hollering to Russia, hey, we're being, Latvians are kicking our ass and they're treating us like second-class citizens. Come help us. Well, Russia will. This is what's going on Moldova. The same sort of situation where enough of ethnic Russians are in the country to complain that the local government is repressing them and treating them bad, and please help us, Russia, because we're Russians. And Russia will use that as an excuse to move in. As it is now, I do know that NATO has sent jets and all that to the Baltic republics. I'm not so sure that much about Latvia, but I know that Estonia and Lithuania have gotten jets. Now, if the situation should boil over up there, then I look for Latvia to become a problem.
Diablo here, and I'm here to at least enlighten what I think of the situation. I do think there is somewhat of a problem with the Crimean and most of the Ukraine and most of what happened in the Ukraine. I think of all the things we could have gotten involved in, this could have been most justified moment. The reason for that being because, for one, when Korea was doing the voting, the voting place was surrounded by military, by the Russian military. The Russian military had surrounded the whole entire country. They were everywhere, apparently, and there was lots of them. And now, this doesn't seem no different, but what I'm trying to say is that it seemed like it was very forced. And if they're going to do this with every other nation, this kind of defeats the point what was installed into most of these countries. These countries are meant to be democracies, and none of these countries can even have a prayer or chance to defend themselves against the Russian nation. I mean, you can say, oh, they voted it in themselves, but what kind of normal people have the talent to defend themselves against Russian trained military men that are trained to kill, men that have guns that most of these European countries do not have. I think of all the things that we could have been justified of getting into. None of the other countries that we have quote unquote installed democracy was unjustified. But at this point, we could have done something, or at least I don't know. It rubs me off the wrong way seeing all these Russians doing the stuff that was happening in Crimea, especially with the Russian military men pretty much standing guard for Putin, and that's just my opinion on the matter. Now let me close this.
Well, Russia used to own that area of the world. It was in 1953 that Khrushchev, magnanimously joined it to the Ukraine. But back in those days, they were all satellites anyway. So at that point, it was just paperwork shuffling. But now it's our headache. But they were part of Russia up to 1953. So they have an argument of saying, no, we just want to return to where we actually came from. Compounded with that was, once again, here's Stalin, the indigenous people, the Khazars, who are mostly Muslim, were mostly deported. Well, they've been steadily drifting back into their homeland, so to speak, and they're also an ethnic minority that who knows who they'll throw in with. I mean, for now, to get shook loose of the Ukraine, they'll probably go along with it. But once they are separate, then they're seeding their own seeds of a further problem, because you can bet at some point they're going to want to break away from Russia. Now that they're broke away from the Ukraine, they're going to want to break away from Russia too, especially depending on what kind of policies they have towards Muslims.
Yeah, and to add some to Diablo's comment, we had a huge thread on lunaticoutpost.com concerning an article that RT put out that had some 100-odd international observers, and I was in a conversation about this on another forum before I was rudely banned and never allowed to come back again, of course. The problem that the person that I was discussing this with, and this was the gentleman from Russia, and he's kind of anti-RT, and he gave a pretty interesting rundown of some of the international observers that they had there. He listed off, like, the people that they had listed in the article. They listed off like 4 or 5 people, and he brought up information, and these people are not necessarily who I would call people without a dog in this fight. They were various. One was like a conspiracy theorist, but not even like necessarily a critical thinker like we are. One had been kicked out of Canada or refused entrance because of various hate speech or things like that he had been involved in. I should have brought the thread up and referenced it right now, but the specific people that they mentioned in the article were not necessarily of the highest caliber of reporters, and not necessarily somebody I would put stock in. Of course, that's not to say anything about the 100 or so other observers that were there, but he did make a point that the only people reporting on this was the Russian television, that they didn't necessarily have, like the BBC, I think, had a story, or the Guardian, and they were really just using the RT article as a source. So he says that it's not necessarily that easy for people to get media credentials to report on that information. So it was kind of solely up to RT to deliver a fair and balanced news report on it. And my personal feelings, I don't think that RT is completely bad. I think that they have a bad reputation, that they do air some stories regarding American stuff that you're not going to see on the mainstream media, but the way they handle it isn't necessarily always the best way, and it kind of comes off as anti-American propaganda. And some things are okay, some things are not okay. It is a form of mainstream media, and then when they catch the propaganda rap, then it goes straight to, that's a mouthpiece for the Kremlin, which it could be, might not be. This is just another form of media that we've got to look at and think critically about, and try and get the proper read on it. So I wanted to kind of balance that out. That yes, I think it's a possibility personally that there might have been some influence, by the military occupying there. As Nolo said, a lot of these people are Russians that were displaced a while back, so they do have an affiliation with getting back into Russia. But there were international observers there. Some of them seemed questionable, and some of them we don't know anything about. So just to keep that on the table. If anybody else has a comment, I would certainly like to hear it.
Well, a lot of people have said, because I think we should do something. I really think we should. And everybody asks me, what do you think we should do? And I think rather than doing anything militarily, I think that we should actually try in some way to affect the economy of Russia. I think we should try to affect the value of their dollar. I think we should try to affect their stock market where it hurts them the most, because what Putin seems to do is, when he knows, like he did with Bush, when he knew Bush was messed up in 2 wars and wouldn't come after him, he went into Georgia. And now when he knows Bush is not going to come in and do anything here, he goes in and takes what he wants. And I don't like that, and I think we should do something.
Yeah, Putin in general, he's an opportunist. Right now he's doing all this stuff because he knows he can do it. That's the truth of it all. And right now it's more than ever because he has China as an ally. He thinks he's unstoppable. Unfortunately, there's laws to consider what he's doing over there, and he's been breaking a lot of them. I would hope Obama would be more strong on this, but he just doesn't give 2 shits about it. And yeah, you guys did point out there is a lot of Russians there, but that doesn't ignore the fact that they have Russian military men there to discourage votes. They discourage votes from coming for the Crimeans to annex themselves to Russia. Still doesn't ignore the fact, even if there was 100 Russians there that were native to Russia to begin with, that still doesn't ignore the fact that they discourage votes. And it's just that simple. They discourage votes with military force, and I find that to be highly ethnically wrong. But Putin is an ex-KGB, and he will try dirty shit. Pardon my language. He will try dirty stuff. Yeah, he will try to do dirty stuff to get what he wants, and that's just the truth of the matter. I'm done. I'm done here.
Well, the question was, what's to do about it? If the Ukraine was part of NATO, there'd already be something done about it, which is why we're keeping our eye on what's happening with the Baltic states, which are NATO signers, which means if any one of them are attacked, we all jump to their defense. Now, if they try an incursion into, say, Latvia, I think the first step, well, the whole Crimea thing was over Russia preserving a warm water port. So to kind of checkmate that sort of move, if NATO is involved, all Turkey has to do is block the Straits of Bosphorus, and there you go. Russia is not going to be able to use a warm water port. They won't be able to enter the Mediterranean. At that point, well, ships may collide, bullets may fly, I don't know. But that is a move that could be made to checkmate Russia, is to say, all right, now your warm water port is absolutely worthless to you because we're not going to allow you into the Mediterranean anyway. And let's see where that goes.
I kind of think Turkey's so in the middle of transition right now that they're so much more concerned in what's going on in them that I don't see that. I'm sorry.
Well, it's not a completely simple and one-sided issue. There are two sides of the issue to be looking at. On the NATO side, you have Russia taking over part of the Ukraine. On the Russian side, however, you have the fact that territory of Ukraine very much wanted to be part of Russia. It becomes an interesting question. For example, what if, and I'm pulling a wild example, Texas decided it wanted to be part of Russia? Do you think the United States would stand back and allow that to happen? No, I don't think so. But Ukraine doesn't have the military power without NATO backing to do anything about it. And since Obama didn't do anything initially, then it's much harder to do something now. Plus, Russia has 80 to 100,000 men on the border. I apologize for not introducing myself. I am Mr. Clean. The other thing about Turkey and that passage is it is an excellent choke point. But what it really comes down to is Turkey, as a member of NATO, willing to stare down Russia and... Okay, sorry, we lost the mic. Probably lost about the time I was discussing, does Turkey really want to sit there toe-to-toe, nose-to-nose with Russia and see who wants to blink over that strait? And does NATO have the air and naval assets in the area to stand toe-to-toe with Russia and see who's going to blink? I'm not sure. It becomes an interesting question. Sure, Turkey's part of NATO, but I don't think they really, really want to take on Russia, personally.
No, but I think the United States might back that up. This is Scarlette. It certainly would make Putin stop and reassess the situation.
Because, see, at that point, as a NATO signatory, you're also involving all sorts of countries on that Russian border. Then you involve Poland. Then you involve the Baltic states. Then you involve... in other words, it's going to be a cascading effect if that goes into effect. But I don't think Turkey is going to basically be the person to actually do the hardware to do the blockade. As a NATO signatory, it means all NATO resources will be used. So make no mistake about it, it'll be the U.S. Navy actually enforcing that choke point. Although, there'll be, an Armenian and Greek and whatever, Italian surface ships in there. I don't know. I'd have to count what's in the Mediterranean right now, but basically, yeah, it could be enforced. Only Turkey would have to worry about is a land war, and for that to happen, then Syria is going to get involved. So this is such a wide, domino type effect. It may be enough to make Russia blink. In other words, it's a chess move to say, all right, so now that you've taken this warm water port, now we've nullified your warm water port, now do you want to rethink that situation? What I think will happen is it'll remain status quo as it is now. In other words, Crimea is lost to Russia. but I think it may give them pause to think to try and take over the Baltics or any other country.
I think you're underestimating Putin there. I really do. And I think if Obama had stuck by the missile defense system that Bush had put the funding out and had started setting up instead of cutting it back. Now, granted, he did take some steps forward with that nuclear defense system recently. But if we had put that into place when Bush wanted it there and when he put it out there to go into place, this would not be going on right now, in my opinion.
Well, what I did notice, this is Liberty, there was originally the comment from Obama that there would be no military intervention, and then once Putin started stacking troops up on the border, there was a press release stating that they were contemplating it. So we're kind of getting mixed messages from D.C. on this. So I'm not sure what direction it would go. I do remember hearing that Putin made a call to Obama talking about wanting to handle this diplomatically, which I thought was an interesting step and a step in the right direction, though I haven't caught up with how that turned out or if there's been any further discussion from either side about it, if anybody else knows.
This is Nolo. Well, remember the off-camera microphone comment that Obama made is telling the Russians, "Oh, don't worry about it. Doesn't matter what I say. I'll deal with you after the election, and there'll be no one to gainsay me." So we have no idea what backdoor arrangements or what sort of posturing that he'll tell the Russians he'll do while not doing anything at all. There's no accountability to the president on his foreign policy. There's no accountability on his domestic policies. So you kind of count that out. Basically, what we have to rely on is the NATO treaties, and like I said, unfortunately, the Ukraine is not a signatory to that. So really, anything the European Union or even us for that matter, our hands are tied. It is, for all intents and purposes, a domestic and border dispute with Russia itself. It would be like them tussling over Mongolia and making us choose between Russia and China. It's like, well, yeah, we don't have a dog in that fight. So although we have a slight precedent about what went on in Georgia, still the problem with Georgia was there was too many political irons in the fire. What you got to remember about most of this is it's a fight over natural gas pipelines. And that's sort of what's going to happen in Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan and all of those sorts of places. Everyone's got an eyeball on that. And Ukraine was just one step on the nationalizing of this gas pipeline deal.
Actually, Nolo, I'm really glad you said that about that unmiked comment, because I wanted to talk about that, because nobody can say what he meant when he said that, but I really believe he knew what Putin was planning, and I believe he knows what further plans Putin has, and that's what we caught that day. And everybody told me, no, don't bring that up because you don't know what was really said. But I agree. I think he knew all along.
There's also, this is Liberty again, we've also had some discussions about, on the board, about the Budapest Memorandum, which I believe was an agreement that the Ukraine would get rid of all of their nukes if various countries would back them up if it came to some type of military confrontation. One particular point about that is this was made before some instability in that government led to kind of a reshuffle of the people, which could quite possibly, this is just speculation on my part, I didn't do much research on it, I apologize, it could have an effect on whether that memorandum is still valid. And the second aspect of that, what I did research, was that this is in fact a memorandum and this is not a treaty. And the research that I did pointed to the fact that while this is an agreement, this is by no means a guarantee of military involvement if in fact the terms are infringed upon. So it's not necessarily a treaty in that aspect. that it's guaranteed military intervention to preserve the sovereignty of the Ukraine. It's more of just I don't know what else you would call it, but a gentleman's agreement, and it's not legally binding.
Yeah, this is Nolo. It's a declaration of intent, which, given diplomatic status and all of that, would eventually lead to a treaty, would maybe eventually lead to the Ukraine's inclusion into NATO. But, remember how antsy Russia got when Poland joined NATO, and the missile defense system, which to my recollection, still isn't set up yet in Poland, but now has been the wheels are in motion, so to speak, and it's supposed to be installed this year. So you can imagine with another country on their border being, armed with missiles. Realize how antsy we got about Cuba having missiles. So, this Russia's, they're looking at the same sort of situation as, any kind of missile on your border you're going to get nervous about. And, of course, they want an insulation zone, which is what they're doing right now in the Crimea. They're accessing more and more of eastern Ukraine so that they have a corridor running to the Crimea so they can defend it. And it's also a buffer zone where they can keep any sort of Ukrainian tank divisions or whatever it is they have away from a quick strike and retaking Crimea. And this is how it's going to feel about any country on its border. And this would be, question was Russia trying to retake its empire? Well, yes and no. They don't want the responsibility of propping up their economies, but they certainly would like the buffer zone between them and the European Union. How that's going to play out like I say, Moldova is the next one, with ethnic Russians saying, we want to secede, we want Russian help. Let's see what let's see what happens with that. Now, I don't think they're a signatory to NATO either, but this is certainly making the Baltic states nervous, enough so that they've asked. England is sending jets, we're sending jets, so we're arming the hell out of that border. So, remains to be seen.
I read this is Liberty. I read a translation of what I believe was part of Putin's speech, and again, I can't swear by the authenticity of this. It was just a thread, and apparently his concern, of course, I believe his concern is over the gas lines, and much of this other stuff is their political posturing and various forms of ways that they're bleeding propaganda to, like Putin is trying to appear strong to his people and take a shot at Obama, possibly, I guess, and Obama is trying to fulfill the will of the people and not come off looking like a wimp. So there's lots of different things at play, and of course the UE, they want their natural gas supplies, and Putin wants the money for that. What I read was his concern was that America is basically forming, bases all along the border, kind of trying to isolate them militarily from the rest of the world. And I could see that. I can understand that. That seems to be the mentality of our government right now is to back everyone into a corner, cut them off however they can. And of course, personally, being a libertarian, I think that that's way overstepping our boundaries and not the intent of what our purposes are at all. But if that was any type of real reflection of how he's feeling, I could see concern about that. I'm no fan of Putin, of course, or I don't really care much about any of the places overseas necessarily. Not to sound too mean about it, but we've got our own problems here in America to worry about, and of course I feel for the civilians that are involved because they've got to live this every day. But it's a tangled web. It's really strange.
Well, the gas pipeline is really at the heart of it, because that just scares the hell out of most of Europe. A lot of their gas runs through that pipeline. And if he chooses to cut it off, a lot of people in Europe are going to freeze next winter. So they're very, very touchy. we don't have any direct, dog in the fight, as you want to put it. But you can bet that the European nations are going to put pressure on us through NATO because they're frightened. Maybe giving Poland anti-missile batteries will help, and maybe it won't. But it's not direct involvement that we have. But if Europe decides to do something about it, they are going to turn to the United States, and then we are treaty bound.
This is Nolo. Well, I got a little background in this. My grandfather was shot trying to get his family out of Lithuania when the tussle between the Nazis and the Soviets, and he took the opportunity to try and move the family out. Well, he was killed, but my mother still, had some stories about the occupation of the Soviets. And growing up, especially in Chicago, there was a large Lithuanian enclave, and every week it was, freedom someday. It was always talk of someday Lithuania would be liberated. Well, here we go. It's less than a generation, and it looks like they're trying to take it back. So I can understand, at least from their point of view, being very antsy about what seems to be Russia trying to retake their empire. I don't think you could convince those people otherwise.
Well, my view is, with the administration's view, with our president, who has always stated he doesn't believe in and isn't for colonization, and the way the Ukraine is so strategically placed and all, that basically it's the bridge from Europe to Asia, so it's going to be fought over, and they're going to continue to do this, and it's just, I don't really know what can be done. I looked so hard on the internet. I tried to get so much more information, and I really hit a brick wall today. The more I looked, there was a brick wall, and I just couldn't get past.
This is Mr. Clean. I have a potentially silly question. We're talking about the area of Crimea. Now, my question is, was Crimea an actual part of Ukraine proper, or was it a territory of Ukraine that they had on them? And that can be a major difference as how we deal with the Crimea and where it goes.
This is Nolo. Yeah, I did state this previously. The Crimea was part of Russia, per se. And in 1953, Khrushchev granted the Crimea to the Ukraine. Of course, realize in those days they were all Soviet clients. So it was more a matter of internal governing as far as they were concerned, and it just removed that area from the central governing of Moscow and turned it over to Kiev. That was in 1953. So that becomes kind of a murky sort of, all right, they gave it to the Ukraine and now they're taking it back. Legalistically, international law, I'm not sure how that stands.
This is Mr. Clean, and I want to get just a little more detail-oriented, just to be absolutely clear. So it was officially a part of Ukraine and not a territory that the Ukraine was controlling, running, keeping in check, whatever, because there's a huge difference between being part of a country and being a territory. For example, California is part of the United States, but the United Virgin Islands are a territory of the United States. A protectorate, if you will, but clearly it's not part of the United States proper. And that's what I'm trying to determine with the Crimea. Was it part of the Ukraine proper, or was it a territory that was being controlled and so on and so forth by the Ukraine, but just a territory and not officially part of the Ukraine country itself?
I think as of 1953, it was part of the Ukraine itself. There was, in other words, all mentions of the Crimea, other than as a geographic location, disappeared. As far as an identity of itself, an autonomous region, no, that was swallowed up by the Ukraine. So, no, I think when they seceded it to the Ukraine, it became part of the Ukraine. I think that was the whole intention of it, rather than to leave it as, per se, a territory, because as it was more or less a territory of Russia, and basically they seceded it to to the Ukraine, and I believe so that the Ukraine absorbed it all as part of itself. If you look at a map, the geopolitical map, Crimea disappeared and Ukraine, replaced it on the map.
Thank you for that detail. I was a little murky on that myself. Understanding that, I'd like to bring out a slightly different example, one that's not happening, but one that might help people in the United States see the issue a little clearer. Obviously, California was land that was gotten from Mexico, and there are a tremendous amount of Mexicans in California. Obviously, if the Mexicans in California decided they wanted to be a part of Mexico again, and Mexico started sending tanks and troops to the border in California, what do you think the United States would do? We wouldn't stand for that for 1 second, but then again, the United States has the military power to send troops and hardware and put an end to that quickly, and with all due respect, the Ukraine does not have that military ability. So a similar situation, though Ukraine can't force the issue, the only way Ukraine could have forced the issue is if NATO got behind them, and I mean with military hardware, and say, okay, you're not taking this over this land, this is part of the Ukraine. Without that, they can't do it themselves. But my analogy for the United States might help people see it a little more clearly that, yeah, some people in Crimea may have wanted to be part of Russia, but that doesn't mean necessarily you break apart a country. It's a much deeper question than that, in my personal opinion. And this is Mr. Clean. I'm sorry for not announcing myself.
Yeah, this is Nolo. Well, we have kind of an analogous situation with Russia taking Crimea. We have Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. Now, what's its legal status? What if the Russians, the Cubans started crying and the Russians came to try and push us out of Guantanamo? I'm not so sure how that would end up, other than we've got a lot more resources closer to it, although this may be a reason why they're arming up Venezuela. Things could get pretty dicey if people start trading, tit for tat and all of that. This could get dicey. Like I'm saying, the only thing I can foresee to kind of forestall to make their grab of the Crimea a moot point is to block the Straits of the Bosphorus, which totally negates their whole idea of holding the Crimea anyway. Here's the problem: who's going to pay the bill? This is, if Russia, the more territory Russia grabs, the more they have to support, and if they're just getting on their feet economically, and the EU and us are going to put embargoes upon Russia, that's going to put a further strain. And all these further strains are going to put economic more, strictures on what goes on how much you can get away with and how much you can do. And all these 100,000 troops, that's very imposing, but that's, 300,000 MREs a day to feed these goobers. So war has not become a simple matter anymore. There's so much logistics and economics involved in the whole process that you're better hope for a quick return, or those troops sitting there are going to be a drain on anything else that you want to do in the world. Of course, I think we've started to realize that, and we're cutting back our military, and now we're in a quandary. We need enough might to keep the land grabbers from happening, but at the same time, how are we going to support that sort of show of force? Russia is looking at the same sort of problem.
The point I wanted to come across as far as the dollar and cents issue brought up by Nolo is an issue that I see the United States military going to, and probably, frankly, the rest of the world following, and that's why you're starting to see a lot more drones and cruise missile attacks as opposed to sending boots on the ground, manpower, if you will, because you can build more and more missiles and shoot them, and drones fly for a long time without having to put any human in danger, and that's one way you can move forward a military without putting people in danger, and that's another way you can have a military effective with much fewer manpower. Instead of sending 10,000 men to take a city. Now I have another question, Nolo. We know that there's between 80 and 100,000 Russian troops on the border of the Ukraine. Here's my question. Is this their normal force that, I mean, even if they're at their normal bases across Russia, is that their normal amount of men that they have anyways? Because if that's the case, then they have to be fed no matter whether they're sitting on the lines on the border of Ukraine or whether they're sitting in their own bases in Russia. They still have to be fed. Or was this a large call-up of men and equipment that wouldn't normally be active?
Yeah, this is Nolo. You're right. This from what I understand, most of these were pulled from, I don't know what they call it, but it's the Moscow division. So, no, these were already standing troops. These are already being fed. I'm just thinking in terms of the headaches of logistics, okay? When you have, 50,000 troops outside of Moscow, and they have their barracks, and they have their little camp stoves and whatever, you're warehousing the food next to them. But when you sit them out in the field, some several hundred miles away, then you've got to move that stuff. You've got to store that stuff. It's not just the feeding new troops. We got new guys now. We got to feed them. No, it's more a matter of shuffling what you have to where they're going. It's anytime you move, you think about the gasoline involved and those things rolling around and everything that has to move with them, including their mail. and there's always coming and going, people leaving the service, people joining the service, all kinds of redistributions of, being transferred to here and there. Anytime that you move from a base that you've had to a temporary in the field, you're eating up material. You're chewing through it like crazy at least 3 times the rate you would if you were just sitting in your normal area. Now, also the timing of this it's just like us having our twice a year or whatever it is in Korea, where we all jump troops around and we march them up and down across the fence, and the Russians do the same. They do have maneuvers where they take everybody out in the field and they have live fire and they drive them through through the mud fields here and there and wherever they have them. That's probably accounted for, but evidently it's the numbers of these in one place that's unusual. In other words, you may have 20,000 here doing war games and 50,000 over here doing war games. Evidently, just clumping them together, 100,000 strong, is slightly unusual. It's a cost in materials. I'm sure some of it is defrayed by the fact that they go through war games, and it's probably a lot of it's accounted for. But then again, war games only last a week, 2 weeks, maybe a month at the most. And so how long do they plan on putting 100,000 troops? To make any kind of political gesture, they're going to be there well into summer. Which is, interesting if they plan on doing something else. For instance, what is making the Polish army nervous? They seem to have some indications that perhaps there's a buildup on their border. The same with the Baltics. Why are they ordering more jets? They must have indications of their own of troops and equipment and such not being moved close to their border also. So I think it's a lot more than just the 100,000 facing the Ukraine. I think that there are troop movements all over Russia at this point, and they're probably moving from the interior to the exterior, which means, like I say, a great deal of reshuffling of men and material, and that's going to chew up. And it doesn't make you money. It only costs you money. So until you can loot somewhere or gain some sort of economic advantage, it's going to be a drain on your economy. So
It is, Mr. Clean, you're right. It is a drain on the economy. It is a drain on the economy, but I also think Russia's especially Putin specifically, is doing it for a specific reason. I believe he's trying to come out with the military and say, hey, the old Soviet Union, we're back. We got the military. We're not screwing around. If we want a piece of land, we will take it. And unless you want to go into a full-blown war over it, there's nothing you can do about it. Another interesting point, at the 100,000 troops on the border of the Ukraine, if you look at a world map, where does that put those troops in a relative position to Turkey? A lot closer than they might normally be in case there was an issue and they were going to march troops into Turkey if they had a problem with NATO/Turkey. Just another interesting thought.
Well, Mr. Kling, this is Tiny. You know Putin knows Europe's not going to do anything to help. He sure doesn't think Obama and America's going to do anything to help. So I understand why Poland is scared, why the Baltics are scared, why all these countries are scared, because nobody's going to help them against him.
Oh, I think if he moved on Turkey, we would intervene. I think we would have to.
I agree. This is Mr. Clean. We do have that treaty, and since Turkey is a full-fledged member of NATO, as soon as Turkey is militarily attacked by Russia, all of NATO must, by treaty, attack Russia in kind.
This is Nolo. There's something about Turkey. I mean, if you look at a geographic map or a terrain map, you're going to find that going through Turkey is not an easy business. This would be the equivalent of Russia trying to attack India. There's some horrendous, terrible landscape to try and get through to get to any of the major population centers or any of the economic centers or any of the agricultural centers of Turkey. You're basically talking about mountainous Afghanistan-type terrain. There's no real strategic or economic capture that you can make in the eastern part of Turkey that would do Russia any good whatsoever. It would definitely occupy and pin down a lot of troops for very little return. They would have to push through all the way to the Bosphorus, and I find with a couple of aircraft carriers stationed in the Mediterranean, you could box them in those mountains in eastern Turkey just easy.
Well, I don't know about the aircraft carriers being a start-all, since Russia is comparatively close, and they've got Syria, where they've got air base, at least one air base that I'm aware of, and 2 naval bases. They've got relatively close points where they can launch military attacks against United States/NATO military. And as powerful as an aircraft carrier is, it's going to be a sitting duck for a couple dozen fighters or 20 to 50 large-scale missiles heading towards it, especially if they happen to be some of the real big ones like Exocet, meant to take out a large-scale ship. And I realize an Exocet is a French, Mr. Clean again, I apologize for cutting you off. I realize that's a French missile, but they sell it to just about anyone on the planet. I apologize for cutting you off.
No, yeah, well, this is Nolo. Yeah, now we're in the area of tactics and war games, and if they moved here, we moved there, and at that point, it's hard to say what would go on. We have Aegis, probably cruisers that could take care of that missile threat. I don't know. At that stage of the game, it's full blown things flying everywhere. Who knows? You know, then it depends on where they actually really want to move. Because at that point, why would they move into an area that they couldn't hold, that has no real economic or strategic advantage for them? That sort of war game scenario probably would just eventually end in nukes being thrown this way and that. And then all of this is kind of moot point, and then we'll all be busy picking up the pieces later. I don't think that's where they want to go with this. I think it's all basically really to put an economic headlock on the EU I think all this posturing and maneuvering that we see in the Ukraine is to gain an economic advantage. I don't see them throwing away whatever advantage they can gain by going into war, which is a losing proposition at this point. You know, it would ruin so much economy that basically it would put you back more steps than you could ever gain by going to war. So you'd have to look into his mindset of why he wants to reabsorb the old satellite countries and reconstitute the old Soviet Union. There has to be some sort of resource that he doesn't have now, that he wants now, and I'd look to that, and I'd look to choking off that to stymie him.
According to Putin, and I quote, "The greatest catastrophe of the 20th century was the breakup of the USSR." And that's all I have to say on it.
Okay, it's China. That's what he sees is going to be the thing that's going to push him forward. I don't think he knows currently what the economic state is in China right now, but I do think that is what's giving him the power to push forward, because China is right now the only economic power that could practically pay off the bills for what Russia wants to do. And that's the only way I can think them ever doing anything. But Steele in the chat is saying, is pretty much points it out, like China and Russia could crush us monetarily. That's where I think that's what Putin is hoping for it to go through, that him to get an alliance, a full-on alliance with China. And that's the only way Russia would move anywhere, to be honest.
It's hard to say what the treaty with China is about, other than just the obvious, you're securing your part of your southern border and part of your eastern border, so that somebody doesn't take advantage of the fact that you have all your troops over on your western border. As far as the economic hinky jinks go, I don't know. I don't think either one of them could survive without either the European Union economy or our economy. I think we're so interrelated at this point. If any one of us were to crash, it would bring down the others. So that's what I'm saying. This dance has got to. The end result is you got to come out with more than what you invest into it. And at the point of all-out war, you're investing more than you're going to get in any sort of return, at least in your lifetime. So at this point, it's going to be posturing, and it's pushing how much he can absorb, how much that will surrender without a fight, how much will just give in just to not be hassled by the whole matter, which, the United States has been trumpeting loudly that, oh, no, we don't, hands off, yeah, do what you want. And with that sort of encouragement, that, I think, led to him deciding that now the time is right to get the Crimea. It's all depending on how much he thinks he can get away with grabbing the other territories back without getting into a hassle. That remains to be seen what his next move is. I think as far as it's concerned now, we can write the Crimea off. There's not going to be any retaking, so to speak, of the Crimea. That's as far as I'm concerned, that's more or less a done deal. That's not ever going to come back. The whole notion is how much are we going to prevent him from keep nibbling away at? And at this point, he could nibble all of Ukraine, and I doubt there's anything that we could do about it. We've demonstrated there's not anything we're going to do about it. Where the rubber meets the road is when he tries to involve a NATO country, where it's not just, he's not picking on one country, he's picking on the entire, all of Europe and us involved. That, I don't know if he's willing to, he may play chicken with us. He may try and call our bluff. I'm not so sure we've got the proper leader to face that sort of bluff.
Absolutely. A lot of valid points were discussed. I think that probably we've covered most of the topics as best it could be covered given the information that we have, and I do appreciate the entire panel for their input, and that would be Nolo, Scarlette, Tiny, Diablo, and Mr. Clean. We had a good time with this. I hope you've been entertained, and maybe if you'd like to discuss this more, feel free to visit the forum that we are affiliated with, lunaticoutpost.com. This is Liberty. This is LOP Radio. We appreciate you very much for listening, and don't forget to check out our YouTube channel for the archive of this show. That's youtube.com/user/biased propaganda. If you're on the forum, you can check my signature. There'll be a link there, and we appreciate it, and we'll talk at you later.